My name is Carol Blakeslee Collin, and today we're spending time with Addie Shields covering the route of the Underground Railroad in Clinton County. Addie.
Our north-south route, the very fact that the lake flows to the north and that the military highway was 1/2 mile off the shores of our county, is very important in the Underground Slave Railroad. In the geography, the rotation of the earth from the west to the east, and then the fact of the flow to the north, and then the very fact that we have tremendous south winds with tremendous waves during this time, cut all of our bays to the northeast, to the northwest from, see them? All right, the other factor is our Adirondacks. In the south, when our settlement came here, when our settlers came, they came by water because the Adirondacks to the south block Clinton County. The Adirondacks became a part for our people to work, but in the settlement, we could not come that way. Our settlers came by water. Therefore, when it came to railroad time, we did not have a railroad south out of here until 1875, but Vermont, over here on this side, had a railroad, and therefore there was access up to Vermont, and there was a very wonderful man over there by the name of Robinson who helped the slaves, and then when he got them over here, now they wanted to go to Montreal. Now first, of course, we must deal with the fact that Great Britain forbade slavery in all of our colonies in the year of 1833. Oh, and therefore we have this wonderful border. We have a border with Canada, and therefore anybody that wanted to get to Canada to be free, and incidentally, you know, when you have been whipped and when you've been hurt, you'd be very, very careful, and you would try very hard to get to freedom, and you would mind in everything that you did to get to freedom. And so we were on this route. We were on this route to get to Canada. This is north of Champlain, north of Perry's Mills, and our Ross's Point. But we got a bad thing right up here. You got a bad thing. You got a collector of customs up here, so you would avoid this unless it may,
come in a little more, Addie, right?
it may be very possible that some of people did go through, because the train came down here in 1851, and so you're talking about the years from 1833 through till the end of the Civil War, when the amendment freed the slaves. And so
where are we going to?
All right, and so all right. So think about the wonderful man over in Vermont, who was Mr. Robinson. And Vermont doesn't show on this side; it's this side of the lake, you see. And when he would have people over here who were very, very careful, you understand that there was a law against helping slaves, and if you were caught, you would lose your property. And then they amended it so that you lose your property and any real estate that you had, so that you did not tell anybody about anything that you did, and you'd have a very careful place to put people. So Robinson sent people over, and they would land over here in Keysville, and there's a very wonderful place, and we're going to go down there and show you. And just think of this: at that time, if you had shoes, they were leather, and you did not get leather shoes wet. Not get shoes wet. And so when we go to Keysville, down to the Bigelow house where they crossed, I want you to notice that there's a big dam way back here that holds the water back. And so on the shore, the river shore of the Bigelows, it was very shallow there, and so they would take their shoes off and probably tie the strings together and have their shoes, and they waded over, and they could come up very carefully. There's a very secretive place.
We can talk about that when we get down there. So let's just go from the different places you want to go.
Okay, and so from then, from the habitation in Keysville, then we went up in here to Peru, to the Smith place, and then the other wonderful person who was helping them a great deal was up here in, now, Emily McMasters, who worked very hard to save all of this and to write to to Anna L. Curtis. There was a place right in here. Wait a minute, right here, right about in front of the fairgrounds, there's a gas station there now, and Emily pointed that out. But up in West Plattsburgh, there was John Adams, and he had a wonderful place. We're going there, and then we will notice that there are other people. So on the Beekmantown Road, there is another place, and then going up to Chazy and to Champlain, and now in Chazy, it belongs to the little Ladue man, I'm pretty sure, caught them right in this bay and took them right west. Or you got to get, after you get over here, you had to get away from the water. And then, okay, but if you landed here, then you end up here to Daya more and so forth. But your route, you see, is from the Bigelow place to the Smith and the Weavers, and up here to John Townsend Adams, and up here to the Chittentons and West Beekmantown. A few were there, but constantly you floated right up here to the north to get over here to Freedom up here. And incidentally too, you didn't always stay in the roads. You know, nobody went out in the middle of a field. You did not walk through the middle of a field. So very carefully you followed the line fences. You know, even animals will do that for cover, and these people did that for cover. They followed so that nobody could trace them. You must not get caught. Nobody could trace them. And so when they got up in here, where nobody knew where the border was, somebody took them along the line fence in the pasture, and they went over in the pasture and then had a friend on the other side. This was all very secretive.
Okay, great. Well, let's go.
All right. We noted that a great deal of the water is held back by the dam back there, and this is where it is shallow. And so someone coming from Vermont, having landed on our shore and having come very stealthily up here, landed here, and then, you know, they eyeballed it. They stood over there in the seclusion and they thought, where can I get across with nobody seeing me? Can I wade that? And then, knowing that this Bigelow was their salvation, very carefully, with their shoes hung around their neck, because you must not get leather wet, you know, and noting this bank over here, how careful it was to come up, and then this door that they were told. So very carefully, they may have stumbled, they may have fallen, but they may have been able to just wade that shallow water, and then this other coming up this bank. And oh, what salvation, how wonderful it was to have that doorknob and have the man waiting for him, because probably, now, because there's cover here, he may not have seen them. Note the woods a little bit on either side. He may not have seen them, but somehow or other he rapped and got through that door, which was salvation for him for a time, to become warm again and have something to eat.
Who is Bigelow? Who owned it?
Apparently Bigelow was the abolitionist, and he worked with the minister and the church that is just here to the south, and the two of them were very careful about, now remember, if they were caught, if this man was caught, he would lose this property. That means that he would not have a place to sleep at night out in the cold, and he'd be shucked around. And so it was a very, very secretive, sensitive thing. And both he and the minister worked together on this, and they probably, whether they knew, whether Robinson told them when they were coming, or whether they just always were on the quiet alertness for someone who was going to come across that stream. Great. We would hope that it was warm, Because when this young man forded the river and had the salvation of that wonderful house in Bigelow's, we would just hope that he'd been fed and possibly that he could sleep. And then at some time when it was just right, when everybody along the route was asleep and it was all dark, and possibly maybe it would be moonlight. You know, when a horse came there, they didn't gallop all the way up here because you had to be careful that a horse didn't put his, you know, the roads were not like these and there might have been potholes. So they picked their way up here very carefully. And then they came to the salvation in this house. And you know, here we have, you need documentation for this, and the good lady, Cora Stafford, who was a historian, Cora Stafford drew for me in 1978 a chart of this, and she wrote exactly what had happened, how that when, and Virginia Burdick documented this too, because this was her great-grandfather's, and her father had told her of how when the slave was very carefully secreted, and nobody knew he was here, because see what a beautiful place this is and what broad lands, and they'd worked so hard to earn this. It's just they did not believe in people being in slavery, and they were trying to get them to Canada. And so when they would get the slave very carefully there, they would wait and possibly come back to the house, and there in the house they had a small fire, and Virginia Burdick said that grandfather remembered seeing a slave with his teeth chattering and beside the profile of him, beside the fireplace, and having hot porridge. And then when he had all that hot porridge, and probably they found another shawl for him to go back in that cold place, another blanket, so he could sleep with, now that his stomach was full and he could had that long journey, maybe his worry was over for a part, but he would have the asylum of that wonderful place to sleep, maybe in the straw or whatever, until they came to get him again.
And what was the name of the grandfather? The Underground Railroad?
The Stephen Key Smith. And you see, these people were good Christians. They were church people, and they believed, they came up here at the end of the American Revolution to have property and to have liberty and to be able to vote, and this was the greatest land boom of all times, and they'd found this wonderful area, but they believed that everyone else should be free too, and they did not believe in whipping people, and so they were a part of doing this, but they had to be very secretive because this land was too good to lose, and they did not want to be put out to have to be in the cold and walk. They had this asylum, and they wanted to share it.
So it was very dangerous for Stephen Key Smith.
It was, yes, I have not used the word dangerous. It was very dangerous for him, yes, because he had children, and this house was warm, and his crops were in and they had food to eat. He wanted to share it, but he did not want to lose his property, and so he's being very, very careful.
Thank you.
Stafford, we're in the Stafford Barn. The barn which shows the enclosure where the slaves were kept. This is the primary source, the only primary source that we can show anyone where slaves were kept in our county. We're dedicated to Mrs. Cora Stafford, who was a historian here in the town of Peru. Cora drew a map for me in 1978, and she listed the facts about this enclosure, and you can see how dark and damp, and you would just hope that there was straw in there. And then Virginia Burdick, who was the descendant of Stephen Key Smith, wrote for us the quotation that her father had told her of being with his father, which would have been Virginia's grandfather, of being in the house and coming down the stairs and seeing that her father had brought the slave from this cold place, and he was in the house at the fireplace, and he was eating a bowl of porridge, but the profile of him, he was shivering, and he had come from this cold place. And we just know that the Bigelows had brought them up here very, very, very carefully not to get caught. This is also very dangerous. And then when we would just be hopeful that when he had that warm porridge that would help him to sleep and to rest, that there would be You see how dark and damp that would be, because the sun never gets in there. And of course they didn't want it to be. No one knew this was here. This is the last building out in the back buildings of the Stafford Farm, and it was located that way because you did not want your neighbors to know, because your neighbors were not always your friends, and some of them might want them to lose this place. And so when they came from the fireplace, and now he was full, and he had something good to eat, and we just hope that he was given a shawl or something to wrap him in, because at that time they were doing homespun, you know, and you just hope there was another piece of homespun to go around his shoulders for when he would come back here and be in the straw and be able to sleep until somebody took him on the next little space, probably not until tomorrow night. And then they very carefully would take him in the darkness of the night, after all the people had gone to bed along the road, all the way up into the next stop at now is Emily McMasters too, you know, who caught all of this material. Emily McMasters died about in 1970. She was the daughter of a family of commissioners of education in Plattsburgh and taught, and one of her dedications was to record this so it would not be lost, because, you know, these people did not write this down. They were very careful about it. No way did you want to even write anything. So Emily McMasters, as the director of the Clinton County Historical Society, Emily drew all of these materials together. And across from Emily McMasters in Plattsburgh, there was a gas station right there as you turn to the left to go in the fairgrounds, and she said that there was an underground place to hide someone there. But then when they developed the gas station, they destroyed it. And so it would be from here to that spot on Route 3, and then up to the John Townsend Adams place, all very careful and at night. And hopefully this man had his heart in his hands, and he was being so frightened, and yet these people were all so good to him, and they were taking him to his freedom across the border. This is the location of the John Townsend Adams farm and homestead. This property was given to him by his father. This is inland from the lake. His father, John Adams, down at Cumberland Head, his father had received his land because he was noticeable. He had put the chain across down there at the river to keep the British from coming up the Hudson. And so when he settled in Cumberland Head, then he did some work for Livingston, and this land had belonged to Livingston, and Livingston exchanged this land with John Adams for the law work that he did. And so he had this son, John Townsend Adams, who was a minister, and he worked in this church, developed this church, and so forth. But what a wonderful gift this was. Do you see the big broad acres? How many acres are there in that wonderful field? And he had slaves, and then to the right there's slaves. And then, because he believed also in the integrity of human life and the fact that no one should be a slave, he became an abolitionist. He wanted to help the slaves as they came north, and he built downstairs in his cellar a wonderful place to keep them. And then you notice that in this location, if he had his slaves working out in the field, they wouldn't ever know if there was another one there. But then if they did have to run, notice how far the distance is, and it was quiet. All they could hear was the wind. But if there were horses that were coming down here, oh, they'd hear that kip cop, kip cop, kip cop. And if it was the doctor coming, they knew it was going to be the doctor. If it was another minister coming. But if they weren't sure who was coming, they would run and hide. And there were these over by the stone walls. There was a little route over to the stone walls. And when this all happened and we became aware of this, we brought Dr. Gordon Pollard up here, because this property, the descendants, it became the property of Ernie Collins. Julia married Collins, and Collins became the supervisor of the town of Plattsburgh. And Ralph Sanger lived up on the hill to the west of us, and he was the supervisor from the town of Beekmantown. And as they motored down into Plattsburgh, he would stop here and pick up Ernie Collins. And Ernie talked to him about this, and then when we taught school, Stella Sanger recorded a great deal of this that Ernie had taught. But then the real thing, when Mr. Pellerin bought that property down there, and then Tartaglios had it, and then there had been a fire, and then Pellerin had a tractor with a strut, you know, the two supports on the front, and he was pushing materials around there, and the front strut went down into something, and there was a roundness there. There was a stoned up round cave down in there. And so following on through, there were little roads out this way to that field to the right, and there was a stone wall over there and one to the left, and then in the front of that house, if you can see right from here, there was a road that we can see in front of us that goes from your left hand to the right, and that road it's disbanded now, but that was the road they came in on, plus there was this road up here. And there was a road from this round cave to that this little underground road from that cave to that. Now, Janet Green was at the station, and I called Janet Green, but would you believe they had stripped the tape and she had nothing. And she had gone to Alan Everest, and Alan Everest had said, oh no, it can't possibly be, because it's not on the map, it is not written anywhere, and also they would have taken a Negro, they would have whisked him at night from the Stephen Key Smith all the way to Champlain. And golly, you know, with the roads they had then, with the holes in them, and the horses couldn't always run fast, you know, because you don't want to break the leg on a horse that's taking you somewhere. And so this was a place. And Alan at that time said to me when I went to him, well, you know, it was test time, and I was correcting papers, and of course this was an intrusion when she called him. But then we called Gordon Pollard into this, and Gordon Pollard came down here when this was all being excavated, and he drew this plate of the underground passages and the underground cave. And you can see down there the wonderful house that's been built over it, and the house has been built right on the foundation. They of course dug up the foundation and so forth, but in the same location. It is a north-south house that looks to the east with the back looking to the west.
Okay, let's
I think my finger's in it there.
Okay. This is a picture.
Mm-hmm.
So what was this?
All right. This is the picture of the cellar. This is a picture of the cellar, and this is one part of the cellar. But then he had an iron gate here because, of course, you're not sure. You want these people to have their integrity and so forth, and yet you're not sure. So he protected his own family because he also had a school down there, a Christian school, and one of the first girls' schools, you know. And so here was the opening upstairs, and here was the little walkway to go out. Here was the road out here, and here was the little cavern where Pellerin's the strut went through into there, and where he disclosed this wonderful round place.
So here was the trap door?
That's the trap door. That's the trap door.
And above it was the living room?
Above it was the living room. Mm-hmm. And of course what they had was now Minnie Wright Wood was of this church. She was a Methodist Christian person. She taught school. She was an educator, and she worked with these girls down here, and she played with them. They were there of age. Julia and she were of the same age. And so she was in that kitchen, and as she said, Addie Shields, that kitchen had a table longer than yours in your big old farm kitchen, and it had an opening, a trap door, and that trap door went down into the cellar. And when people came, if someone came looking, and you know in this world, everybody, you have to be very careful. You never know who your friends are. Neither did John Townsend Adams know. And so if someone came, and think of it, he did not want to lose his property, but he believed in setting these slaves free. And so he had, if people came, they would all sit down at the table, and they had the rug underneath there. Maybe they were eating, maybe, and so this was never disclosed. This was never disclosed until Pellerin, that strut went through there, and Pellerin got Dr. Gordon Pollard, and this is Gordon Pollard's map. Almost bad fact. You know, there's another shot up there by the Locusts. Let's go get it.
Oh, let's, hold on, can you hold on the house a bit?
I see where I got that. It's hard to find sometimes unless you make a file and put a listing. This is the North-South Road. Notice this wall that was laid up here, probably by those, his slaves that he had manumitted. John Townsend Adams had manumitted, but also his people who had come to work with them to tarry here for a while until they got to their freedom in Canada. This is the border of the North-South Road, and this is where they would have come, and then he would have from Bigelow's or from Plattsburgh, and then they would have gotten our Stafford's, and then very carefully into the cellar, and there they would have been fed and clothed and kept warm and possibly worked here. But isn't this a wonderful North-South Road? And somehow, you notice it's on a high ridge where there'd be good footing for the horses. It's not down there low in the mud there. It's up here high. There's a little ridge here. And it would have taken them straight to the next northern place. One of the things that we felt badly about was Janet Green destroyed those tapes. And we did have what Dr. Pollard had done. And we do have, just look at these stones. Aren't they beautiful? Now they are erratics. Once in a while they are field stones, but to a great extent we're in glacial till up here. And these people worked with what they had. And you wonder if the slaves laid these up. This is the Bruno Trombley location. Notice the chop. Notice the curve of this bay. If they had, no one ever knows when you start out on the lake where you're going to land, where the wind is going to bring you. But the wind brought them into this natural cove. And there was Bruno Trombley's house, and there was that little ravine where you could go right along the ravine, right up, and there was a little building in back of this house. And there was another place to be for salvation until they could get not straight up the lake, but inland and away from where someone would catch them. Notice the map. Here is the map which clearly shows. Notice that bay that's cut to the northwest from the southeast, and notice that road right there. See how handy that road was to go inland and to go right straight up to, see where it went, up Champlain? Because always they were just a ways from being saved and now a free man up in that border. Notice the closeness of that road. This bay, notice the curve of this bay, what a location this was. And someone had laid this out, or let us say they took advantage of this lake, how it made this little cove, this little bay, and here they were, and there was the road for them to escape on. And they didn't want to go up along the lake and get caught up there in Ross's Point with the collector of customs, and see how that road took them inland, and see how close when they got up there to the Chazy River and they crossed the Chazy River, see how close they were to freedom in that border. Great. This is the citation. This is the location of the Tintin, the Rolson-Tintin farm. When Rolson went off to college, they hired Harry Tintin to work for a time to carry on that farm. And this, in the little small, if you look in the picture, the very small house in that structure that was just the size of a log cabin. There is documentation when Annie Emerson Lowe went north on the railroad in 1853 in October, that house was all afire. Now looking at this picture from Heard, notice all the other buildings. They weren't here. It was just that little house, and it was October and it was getting cold, and it has a removable hearth in it. And so those people, with winter approaching, they rebuilt that little house. And then you can see as time went on and they had some money, they built 3 other things. They built the Greek Revival there out of the the Matt House brickyard down in East Beekman Town, which was just a little ways to the north. And then you see the long, narrow, that was their carriage house, woodshed, and that became their milk creamery. And then the last building was built, the one way over to your right, was built about in 1920, and please God, what a beautiful location. But this is where, when they came, now did they come from Plattsburgh? How, but where they came from, wherever it was, there was that removable hearth where they could be just fed and put down there, and then put the rock back and sweep the ashes over it, and anybody come in to find them, they would never find them. What a comfort. And they were just another little space closer to the north where they would be free. This is the location of the Clifford LaPlante house. However these people got here, the railroad spur was just across. And when Clifford LaPlante was alive, he told that before this mansard roof house was here, the previous house that they tore down and so forth, that house had a removable hearth and a little compartment where they secreted the Negroes, because you know that railroad was running east and west. West, the St. Lawrence River, to go inland, but from the Lake Champlain there, and they were avoiding the lake, but just straight, there's a road just in back of us that goes straight north, and they're just 2 miles to freedom. And so this was another station, the Clifford LaPlante station in Champlain, New York. We're here at Noah Moore's grave, and just ahead of us is his father, the Judge Plennymore. These were the Presbyterian people who came here from the Hudson River Valley with the Christian ethic that everyone should be declared equal and given the privilege of life. And it is Noah Daya, who we've just come from the LaPlante area, and the Clifford, of course, lived there in that house and just died back in 1970. But Clifford had the original house, which he tailored over, which did have the secreted area, and then they were coming up here, and Noah Daya was the one who secretly, walking around, made the arrangements to go from here to there, and we're just across the border. We're just near what was heaven to them, to be free over in Great Britain's province from 1833 on, when slaves were not allowed in any of Great Britain's province. And of course we are just 1.5 miles, 2 miles from Canada. But here is the graves of all of these good Presbyterian people who were abolitionists, who had very secretly in their minds, and very secretly went around from one person to the other and laid out how you got this person from here to there. Noah Daya Moore and his old father over there, Judge Plennymore. Today we started with the Bigelows when someone may have came up the railroad. We didn't have a railroad, you know, through the Adirondacks, and so they came up to Robinson's, and then Robinson got them across the lake. And if they landed in there and landed and went across the river, the Osable River, and had the comfort of being there in that Bigelow house, it was Stephen Key Smith, and then up to Stephen Key Smith, and he also worked. All of this was laid out from Noah Daya and these wonderful people who had this networking, this secret networking, this underground railroad, which was really on top of the ground. But of course, of course, was secret, and therefore no one knew of it, because these people would have lost their property. But what a wonderful place to be in this cemetery up in Glenwood, with Noah Daya's grave and his good father, with the Christian. At that time, the church was their social life, and they believed that everyone should have, and it is written here, the presbytery regarded the traffic in slaves, or the holding in bondage of our fellow men, or whatever complexion or country, as a high-handed immorality. You hear that? A high-handed immorality to enslave anyone, opposed to the law of God, and should be condemned and reprobated by every church of Christ. These were God's people. These were the people that brought the slaves up to freedom, just a mile and a half, and Noah Daya arranged and got them across the border to freedom.
Okay. Addie, thank you very much. You've given us a wonderful tour of the Clinton County Underground Railroad, and we appreciate it.
It has been fun. It has been a part of my life, because when I first became county historian, we found all of this, and I just was tumbled into it, that we had to prove what we could, but we used Emily McMasters. We need to thank Emily McMasters for the recording that she did. Everyone does what they could in their area, and Emily McMasters did. It has been fun today.
And then you follow in some great footsteps.
Thank you very much. We got the sky here.